Hello, welcome to Mystic Mondays. And of course, as you can see, it is just me today. But as you probably know by the title and the description, I'm going to be sharing an audio from last weekend when I went to the TrueCrime Podcast Festival. And it was all about ethics and diversity in the paranormal, folklore, and adjacency even to the true crime space, I would say. So before we get started, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to last weekend and talk about the podcast convention and what to expect going forward. So last weekend was the True Crime Podcast Festival, and it was hosted in Denver, Colorado. And I got invited to do a panel with Haunted Detective, Espooky Tales, and Susto Podcast, and all were great panelists, all were great people, and I'm so glad that I got to have that experience and also go back to Denver, Colorado. For those of you that don't know, I used to live there for 10 years, over 10 years, honestly, and I will always have a special place in my heart for Denver, Colorado. It was the place where I met my husband, I evolved spiritually, I evolved in terms of my psychic abilities and mediumship abilities, so it's just a very special place in my heart. Now, when I got invited to the panel, I was talking to the director, Lainey, shout out to her. She is so huge on inclusivity, diversity, and I can't wait to see the next conventions that she will be hosting next year. I know one of them is Beyond the Veil, so stay tuned for that on my social media platforms. I am planning on going. It will be hosted in New Orleans next year in the fall, so stay tuned for that. Of course, because this podcast is all about inclusivity and diversity, I do want to give a warning, okay? If you are somebody that maybe doesn't talk about these topics enough, which you should, but if you're somebody that doesn't talk enough about these topics, you might get triggered, right? I think that, one of the things that I've noticed time and time again, when people don't talk enough about it, they can feel not ready to talk about it or defensive. And I can see where they're coming from with that, but I also invite people to listen intently, learn, reflect, and grow as a person. And it's something that I'm very passionate about. And I'm sure you guys noticed already that in the last several weeks, I've had a guest, and I always ask them about their paranormal experiences. But I've been trying to have, I always think about it in the forefront of my mind of like, how can I include and be more diverse and inclusivity? I'm going to be a little bit vulnerable here, okay? And so as a Latina woman, I feel like it's been often hard for me to get invited to do panels and talk about ethics and diversity, or talk about my experiences navigating making paranormal content or spooky content. And when I was a cosplayer, I know I used to cosplay, I would rarely see that representation on panels. I would rarely see someone of color or someone from a marginalized community host panels. And so grateful for Lainey and True Crime Podcast Festival for allowing someone like me and the panelists to be able to have a panel and talk about what they are doing in their work. I think it's so important because folklore, urban legends, paranormal, all of that phenomenon, there is a lot of Western bias to it. And, if we really dive deeper into that perspective, we know that in the Western perspective of it, there is patriarchy in that, right? It's told through the perspective of the white male patriarchy. That's literally, history. There's so much evidence on that. I'm not making it up. There's so much evidence on that. And I think we did a deep dive a couple of episodes back with Pamela and I, where we talked about the statistics of what paranormal is and how it's broken down and the demographics of that. So if you are curious, definitely give that an episode a listen. I think that for people on the internet, whether you are doing a podcast or you are a content creator or you're doing YouTube, so on, right? We get to break those barriers and really help build a community. At least I'd like to think that we're all building a community for the right reasons. And so when I went to this convention, I really thought a lot about that. How am I proactively creating content and creating a space for people to feel included, to feel like we are uplifting each other? We need to make sure that we are being mindful of that. And also, even if you are somebody that is wanting to have a project, whether it's working in a corporate job or retail, whatever job you have, right? How can we proactively be inclusive? I think that's something that I've always been so mindful of because I am a Latina. But, even for me, like, even as a Latina, right? Like, I'm not an exemption of microaggressions, right? Like, we all have a level of microaggressions, and how can we learn from these things, right? I did post something, and it talks a lot about inclusivity and the ethics. And I'm so proud of everybody on the panel for talking about this, bringing awareness to this, um, because the paranormal does need more of that. We need more people to advocate for inclusivity and diversity. So I'm going to be playing the audio, and I'm going to be posting the video on my YouTube. So if you do want to watch that, stay tuned for that. So what I'm trying to do going forward is posting the audio podcast on Mondays on my YouTube. But if you are watching me on Spotify, you get to watch the video up front on Mondays. And then Wednesdays is where the video will be posted on YouTube of the podcast. And then Fridays, I am working on a compilation series. So all of my TikTok compilations you can find on Fridays. So I already posted 2 videos from my TikToks from 2020, and it's a little cringe. Yes, I know. 2020 TikTok. Okay, can we talk about that for a second? I know we got into the heavy stuff here and we're about to get into the panel stuff, but can we quickly talk about 2020 TikTok and how much I miss that? I miss the cringe. I miss the like low lift content that was just so entertaining. I do miss 2020 TikTok so much. And so yeah, you'll be seeing that, but I'm going to, of course, post from 2020 to recent. You'll be seeing a lot of compilations, so stay tuned for that. And of course, if I have footage to edit in terms of paranormal investigations, I will be posting those also on Fridays. So stay tuned for that. And without further ado, let's get on to the panel audio.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Pamela J. I am from the Haunted Detective Podcast, and I'll be moderating this wonderful panel. So first and foremost, I want to welcome everyone to this discussion, and it's on a topic that straddles the realms of the mysterious and the moral. So haunted places and their spectral histories and uncanny atmospheres, they serve as a fertile ground for storytelling. Yet as amidst the thrill of ghostly tales, we confront ethical dilemmas. In today's discussion, we will illuminate the shadows of the paranormal and folklore while preserving the integrity of both the stories and communities behind them. Today, our panelists will bring a diverse array of perspectives, all united by a shared passion for storytelling with integrity. So, we will dive into ethical considerations that underpin our fascination with haunted places and paranormal investigations, folklore, and the moral compass that guides our narratives. Well, it wouldn't be haunted without having some technical difficulties. Okay, so first I want to introduce all of our panelists. I'm going to let them say their name, their podcast, and a brief introduction, and then we'll get into the discussion. Sound good? Okay, I'm started off with Kelsey.
Hi, I'm Kelsey from the Haunted Detective Podcast. This is my beautiful and lovely co-host. We are an ethical, paranormal, and true crime podcast that really investigates the unusual and unknown, kind of the darker side of things. We like to say that I'm the paranormal Sherlock Holmes, so I guess that pretty much summarizes it.
Stephanie?
Oh yeah, so I'm a Salvadorian psychic medium. I do paranormal pop culture content. I've also worked with like legacy YouTube channels such as BuzzFeed Unsolved, also Something Scary, and I've also worked with other places in terms of doing like paranormal investigations. And I guess like my angle is I'm really passionate about bringing the historical side of things in terms of paranormal investigations and knowing that like ghost stories are history, so it's really important to include diversity and inclusivity on that front.
And next.
Hey, cool friends. My name is Adrian, or Aiden, either way. I am the host of a podcast called Susto. It's a Spanish word for fright, but it's also a cultural or folk illness. But the show is centered on paranormal folklore from Latin America and Hispanic cultures. It's narrative driven, so each episode focuses on a different legend with music and sound effects. And then after, I like to talk about whether or not there are any deeper meanings behind the stories.
Thank you. And last but not least,
I'm Christina and Carmen, and we co-host Espooky Tales, a podcast about haunted places, myths, legends, and folklore in Latin America. We are a little more casual, but we tell the stories of our people, and yeah.
fantastic. Okay, so we're going to dive into the discussion. So first, I want to tell everyone, all of my panelists, that I might direct a question towards you, but please feel free to answer and add on to the discussion after the first person has answered. Aiden, you're first. So, how do you define an ethical approach when discussing folklore and hauntings on your podcast?
He's talking. Oh, yeah.
Give me a sec. I think just approaching it from a very genuine place. I grew up reading a lot of these stories, so it feels kind of like secondhand to me, and I know that I'm doing it from a place of curiosity about my own culture. My own culture is how it started. I'm Mexican American. I grew up on the Texas-Mexico border. And so the stories that I heard, the stories that I started the show with, are from that region, Texas, and from northern Mexico. But then in doing my research, I was making connections to other cultures within the Latin American and Hispanic diaspora. And there were connections I didn't think existed, whether it was similar cryptids with a different version of the story, or a completely different cryptid or spirit, but the stories are similar to something that I heard. And so, again, approaching it from a place of genuine curiosity and appreciation, I think helps when you're trying to do that.
Thank you. I think there's anything I want to share. No, I see you as a
Yeah, and a lot of the same things that I completely agree with for us too, but also I think always looking deeper, like what is behind the first initial legend we all hear. Because take an example of La Llorona, we all heard a version of the same story, a woman who kills her children because the man she loved leaves her. But it's more than that, because when you look way deeper, the legend could have been taken from a Mexica or Aztec goddess who is crying for her people. She's not crying, they're all her children, and she's crying, my children, because the colonizers are destroying their world. There's another version that our other co-host who's not here, MJ, heard, and she's from the rural part of Mexico, and there was a war, and a woman leaves really quick to buy something at a store. To go get food, something like that. She leaves her children, and while she's gone, the military comes in and kills them. And she is crying for them, and she is this woman who lost her children in that way. She wasn't someone who was left by a husband and killed him with revenge. She is a hurt woman, and she is seeking for revenge. There's another really good movie and I'm not sure if there's more folklore behind that movie, but it's called La Llorona. By Jairo Bustamante, and it's from Guatemala, and they basically based the legend of La Llorona, a woman who lost her children during the Guatemalan genocide, and the people who committed this genocide, they go free, they never face justice, so she takes justice into her own hands. So always looking for what else happened, what else is informing this legend.
I kind of wanted to expand upon that, especially for me personally. I can speak to Jewish culture because a lot of people take Jewish culture and don't really look deeper into it. And of course, I'm speaking to that personally. I can't speak for your guys' culture and anyone else's, which is another thing. Always understand that you can't speak for someone else's culture. And a lot of creators don't understand that. Just quickly before I talk about Jewish culture, is people covered skinwalkers and Wendigos, and people, the indigenous community of TikTok were like, hey, stop doing that. And the main thing that was happening were these white creators were like, no, I'm not gonna stop. Or there was the white savior complex coming in, where they were coming in and commenting on indigenous people's videos saying, that's wrong, that's not correct. And the same thing happens with every marginalized community and our lore and folklore. And specifically with Jewish culture, you have the Dybbuk box. And there's a non-Jewish man who created this fanaticism on eBay for money, and it insulted the Jewish culture, and people started speaking for my community, thinking, I know this better because I read about the Dybbuk box. And what they didn't do was look deeper into the religion, look deeper into the culture, and ask, what is a Dybbuk? What is this? What is that? Kind of like you were saying with La Llorona. Sorry, did I pronounce that right?
Yes.
Yeah, no, good job. Yeah. So, Christina, I'm passing it back to you. How do you verify the accuracy and authenticity of folklore and haunting narratives that you disseminate, and which sources do you rely on for most trustworthy information?
For us, because we're only talking about Latin America, and because I am blessed to know Spanish from birth, I always go to the websites in Spanish, especially if it's like I'm looking at Argentina, then I will look at websites, these old newspapers, the local YouTube channels. Sometimes they're so small, you can find someone asking someone, what happened here? So as much as I can find local sources, if we're talking about Mexico and El Salvador, then I always ask our parents, hey, have you heard of this? And family members, because there's always a version within our family too. But always just trying to find the people who are from there. If I don't know anyone, then just looking online for those specific places. And I know it's harder when you don't know the other language. Sometimes if I am looking at something that's not in Spanish, then I'll use Google Translate, but also always looking at like their local sites and things like that. Okay.
I wanted to add on too. Oh, sorry, Greg. The other thing I've learned is that a lot, especially here in like the US, since I've lived here in Colorado now, like I moved back to LA. I think of what's really a misused source is going to like your local like history museum. A lot of these places, not only do they need funds and sponsorships, stuff like that, and donations, but they're more than happy to talk to you about what actually happened in a verbal way, sit down with you. Like there's so many amazing people. Also, if you know a Mason, Freemasons have so much archives and catalogs. So whenever like my husband and I go to like any state and we know a Mason, we will contact them, and they're open to the public too. So just a fun fact, like even if you don't know a Mason or you're not a Mason, you can go to your local like Masonic lodge and like contact someone to talk to you about the history there. So we went to Salem, and the historian, the Masonic historian, was telling us where all the witch trials were happening in Salem, and something that we did not get when we were doing tour guides. So that's also just another resource that you guys can use.
Something that really helped me, for those of you who have not tried looking up anything about Russia on Google, it's hard to find anything accurate, and I think it's a lot of westernized fear about that culture. But I reached out to local professors, and I went to the colleges, online mostly, and talked to all of them. And I reached out to, I had a friend who was from Russia, and so also just like colleges and professors can be such a big resource, and it helped me so much with the first season of my podcast.
I would say really quick. I think a big misconception about the kind of stories that we tell them and cover is they're all very anecdotal. I'll speak personally for folklore. It's stories that are passed down generation to generation, but they are more documented than even I knew when I started. I have several books in my bag right now, but I presented one yesterday. It's called Bloodsucking Witchcraft, and it's a study of supernaturalism in Tlaxcala, Mexico, when they called it a Tabarimbuchi epidemic, which is this cryptid that the community said was to blame for the death of 7 infants in one night. And there was a sociology researcher in the community already, and his research shifted when that happened to studying this community, their response to the deaths and the paranormal. And it's an entire academic book, and it's just this wealth of knowledge on, again, supernatural stuff.
Just reminded me, my Lord and Savior, Melinda Gordon, be like her, go to the town archives. That's another huge one. When I was dealing with a haunted house growing up, we actually went to the historical center and to the archives, because that's where that was. Or researching for season 2, I called the Bridgewater Town Archives, and I was like, oh my God, I'm Melinda Gordon? That's crazy.
So I love that we're on the topic of talking about things that we might not know a lot about and really researching and asking the right people and the right questions. So how does everyone approach stories that involve folklore originating from cultures that might be different from your own? And what measures do you implement to prevent cultural appropriation or even misinformation being spread?
I think almost the same as even just the last question, trying to go into like the local source, looking at the different versions, maybe even sharing all the different information that I found instead of focusing on just one. Like, I heard it this way, but this is something else that I found, and also never misrepresenting it, because a lot of people will take a story and then say, maybe like a sensationalized version of that story instead of sharing everything. And so I really always just sharing everything, being respectful about what we're sharing. And yeah, I think.
Yeah, I'll add on to that too. So for my podcast, I realized that I wanted to have more diversity of people with different backgrounds on my podcast, because if my podcast is more like I'm interviewing people and they're sharing their paranormal experiences, but they usually have they're a specialist in some aspect of things. So I told myself that I was going to have a guest. So as an example, I recently had a therapist who he is a queer man, that's what he identifies, and he's a licensed therapist, and he was telling me about his experiences. So I also think it's also just in a way parallel to the last question, you want to talk to people that are very different than your own background and get their perspective when it comes to stories that you're trying to share.
I was going to say, I think just also being very honest with your audience. If you come to a dead end, you can say, hey, I came up on a dead end and I'm going to look more into this, or asking the audience for their help and saying, if anybody knows anything about this, or if you've seen something or heard something, please send it in to me. I know my show ultimately it's about facilitating conversations, and so I'm very open to receiving not only information but also correction from the people that are listening.
I think also understanding, and this goes to the last question as well, it's not your story to tell. If it's not your culture, it's not your story to tell. And just remind yourself that and give yourself that pep talk before covering it, because I think it's really easy to get swept up into the story and to get, lost in the moment. And so to keep yourself in check, just say, hey, and this goes for true crime too, this is not my story to tell. So that's been my way that I've kept myself in check, especially covering Latino stories and folklore and indigenous folklore.
Thank you. So I'm going to throw it to Stephanie. So Stephanie, what ethical considerations should be taken into account when conducting paranormal investigations in locations associated with tragic or sensitive events such as murders, suicides, or natural disasters?
Yeah, and I love that question is on here, because I feel like I've been seeing on the internet more and more conversations and people trying to go to places of tragedy and trying to do paranormal investigations. Gypsy Rose, I feel like a lot of people know that topic right now and what's been going on with that. And I recently stumbled upon a video where these paranormal investigators went to the house where the tragedy happened, and but that they were they're outside of the house, that they were doing a paranormal investigation. And I think I just really urge people to really think about these actions and why you're doing what they're doing. When it comes to Gypsy Rose and that case, it's she's online, she's telling her story, we have multiple sources telling the story. We don't need to go and try to communicate to her mom, Dee Dee, and try to, for what? What exactly? It's so disrespectful and it's very dehumanizing. And so what I ask people to think about, especially if you are into the paranormal and paranormal investigations, is when you think of these cases and places of tragedy, what's your angle? Are you trying to bring and add on to the conversation in terms of historical value, cultural value, or are you just doing it for shock value? And if it's just shock value, do not do it. I really urge people to not do that, because it just diminishes the belief system of what people believe in the paranormal and spirituality, and it's just really just distasteful, I would say.
Yeah.
But then the other thing I want to add on too is that if this also goes with true crime, right? If someone just passed away, you're not going to make a story on it the way you would covering Ted Bundy. So why is it any different when it comes to paranormal phenomenon and places of tragedy? So that's my take on that.
And if you don't know where to look for sources, you can always go to the TrueCrime Podcast Festival and sit in on sessions like using ethical language when covering these topics. Be very mindful of that approach.
Absolutely.
What was your name?
I think also something Stephanie, Pamela, and I were talking about in the car over here is humanizing things. I mean, there are so many stories about ghosts and like they're demons, they're evil, they're gonna haunt you, they're gonna do this. And it's the same with true crime. They tell the stories of these victims and they're like, and she was axed in the face, and there's nothing. This was the person. This was what she was like. This is how her friends perceived her. Same with the spirits. Like when you're going to the Gypsy Rose house, you're not thinking about the fact that Gypsy was also a victim and you're communicating with her abuser. Why are you trying to give that spirit a platform, right? That person a platform. And so I think a lot of creators, and this has been fostered in the television world a lot, we remove the humanity from it and we only see the entertainment.
So everyone kind of mentioned that you guys search for people that know more about something to learn more so that when you spread you release your podcast or release a video, you want to make sure that all of your information is as viable as possible. So when you are going out and reaching out to historians and you're reaching out to cultural experts or professors or even a friend that lives in that specific area, how do you go about it to make sure that it's respectable?
I guess I can start it. So in the slide you can see where I went to Mintryville. So a lot of my investigations that I do, I always go with the historian. I've noticed in a lot of paranormal investigations, you normally never see the historian with the group. I always try to have the historian there so he or she or they can verify it. Because the last thing I want to do is make a video. Even like with Mari Jesse, we went to Fort Morgan and we did a fire department investigation there, and we had her brother and another firefighter there to verify the history and the story that has been going on in that place. So I just think that it's so important to have a person there that is acting as a historical or the historian person in these investigations, so that way you're not saying Molly Sue is here and there's no such thing as a Molly Sue there, and then you spread these stories. Like the Stanley Hotel is another great example of this, where I know a famous ghost and paranormal team went, and they were spreading that the crystals and rock formation underneath the Stanley is what kept the spirits there, when there was never any like actual resources on that. And then it turns out that the city, I believe, went to the Stanley and they actually started getting rock formation samples to verify if this was true. It got that big, and then they found out that there was never any rock formation. So not only were we spreading lies, but we were also using the resources and money on something that simply just was not true. So that's one of the reasons why when I do these investigations, I try to think of having an expert of that place with me.
First of all, I didn't know that because I watched that episode and I watched that growing up. So thank you for telling me that. For me personally, when I'm covering stuff, because I don't do as many investigations, I ask permission. That's my biggest thing, and that's it for me. I implement all of the stuff, but for me, the biggest thing is to ask permission.
So when you're going on these paranormal investigations, how do you balance respect for private property and the desire to explore historic locations? Because we've seen in recent pop culture that they will break into historic places, they'll damage property, and it might give people a really bad taste for paranormal investigation. So how do you do that and make sure that it's respectful?
Probably don't break in. You're not like going in.
You don't like the crime?
Yeah. Wasn't okay. No, I'm just kidding. No, but also a lot of these old places are more dangerous, not because they're haunted, but because there's I don't know, asbestos. Like the structure is dangerous and not safe. So yeah, honestly, just like don't. If you're not allowed to be in there, there's probably a reason.
So just don't ever go. Like just don't go.
The other thing too, though, I want to say is I think because
I know a lot of paranormal investigators and people that cover these topics, mutuals with that. And one of the things that, like, even with those creators, they do a phenomenal job. And I'm really lucky to be surrounded by amazing paranormal investigators in terms of mutuality. But one of the things I will say is that I genuinely feel like there needs to be more advocacy for creating an environment to help donate to these communities for a good cause, for humanitarian causes. So like in my work that I do offline, I work with brick and mortar shops. Yeah, they may have a haunted story there, but I really want to bring in, like, support local businesses, and I see it as like this is an opportunity to help a museum get funds for something and spread awareness on the history and tragedy that may have happened here, while also bringing donations. So whenever I go to these places, I always like pitch that to them, like, hey, you know, like, I'm going to be covering your story. I try to as much as I can, of course, but like, and not always, sometimes they're just happy to have us there. But like, if there is a time and place for it, like Mitreeville was a great example. Like, myself and the other people that went, we all told our audiences to donate to the museum. So I think rather than breaking in, like, look at it as a reason to do something good for your local community.
One thing that I see a lot of more niche down abandoned creators do, where they go to abandoned properties, and normally these creators actually do have permission from the local government. They don't share the location. They don't tell people, these are the coordinates. I walked this way through the woods, because graffiti is such a big problem. Towns like Dudleytown, which is one of the most famous cursed haunted towns in America, they don't let people in. You'll get arrested. Like, you look at it wrong and they're there with handcuffs arresting you. So I think a really big thing is, if you're getting invited to do things, as a lot of creators do, don't give away the location, because that's really disrespectful to the local community and to the history of the place. And then to expand upon what Stephanie said, because that was really well said, I've seen a lot of YouTubers turn their paranormal investigations into travel content in the beginning. So they show videos of them going to local businesses, buying stuff, eating food, drinking beer, whatever it might be, and like being shown around by a local or just going themselves. And I think that's, for me, when I start doing YouTube content, that's how I'm going to implement what you were talking about.
Yeah, so a lot of these historic places, they hold a pretty dark story to them usually, and that's what makes people really want to go and investigate. So something that's interesting is that these dark stories are usually involving someone real, and they involve a human being. So have you ever encountered a story that you felt was just way too sensitive to bring to light, or maybe there was details that you wanted to leave out, just out of respect, and how do you handle that situation?
For Pamela and I, because we're very heavily true crime, we don't cover over-popularized stories or cases. So not to go back to true crime, but it's the perfect example, like Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, we refuse to cover that. We have gotten so many DMs and comments like, why haven't you covered Ted Bundy? Well, because everyone has. Everyone's covering it, and there are cases that deserve attention, and there are stories that deserve attention that people don't cover. I'm trying to think, what would you guys say, like, the paranormal example of that would be? I don't have it on the top of my head.
I guess, actually, okay, I'm sorry, I did not, I'll keep up to you guys.
I was gonna say, and because I only talk about America, so I don't, there's a lot of things that I already don't talk about, but if I were to ever, cover something else, I know a lot of people, when it had happened, and I don't even remember the guy's name or the family. I just remember the case. It's like a man murdered his family and the two children, and like Cocomelon dedicated the characters to like two of the kids. So I remember that about them, but I don't remember their name. But people were going to the house after because they had said that like police had caught like some sound in the footage. And people were releasing this footage over and over again. People were going to the house. So that kind of stuff is like the thing that I'm like, I would never, if a recent true crime case that is just so recent has some paranormal activity attached to it, I don't even think that I would share the paranormal activity. Because it's like inviting people to focus on that instead of someone who lost a family. Another thing that happened with that same case is that the guy was saying, the guy got with like another woman later, and that woman was a witch, and it was all her fault. She was cursing the family, and I could not believe when I was seeing that. I was shocked. So yeah, she's shocked.
I will add on this too. So for me, like I recently been doing this video series of like top 5 haunted places in your state, and I just did the Colorado one and I did the California one. And for California, I was trying to add places that I know they are desperate to tell their stories and they're desperate to have investigators have I wouldn't say desperate, but they're happy to have them. Let's put it that way. And people are like, what about the Queen Mary? I'm like, everyone knows about the Queen Mary. Everyone knows about the Stanley. Let's do other places that have really amazing history to it, but also they want you to go in there and experience like the hauntings if you're willing to want to have that experience, of course. So that's the equivalent of like just, you know, looking at your local town and sharing those stories and there are the legends to that.
I think with like with folklore, a lot of it is based in history. And like I mentioned, like I try to think critically about these stories. Excuse me. I try to think critically about these stories that people would assume, you know, are just completely based in fiction. They're made up. They're ghost stories. But a lot of them are based in reality, or they perpetuate certain ideas and stereotypes. So what I try to make sure to do every time is, again, kind of break down and unpack what does this story mean. So like with the story of the Roman Dance with the Devil, you know, it's a story that this young, pious, religious woman, like her parents had went out and she ended up dancing with the devil and she died, right? And so for most people, it's like, okay, well, that's where the story ends. You think, well, what does that mean? Okay, this bad thing happened to her because she broke the rules. But then in researching the story, I'm seeing that the one through line, because there's so many different versions, is that it's always happening to a young woman. And so then exploring, well, what does that mean? What ideas are we perpetuating? What ideas are we sharing to our kids? Because I heard that story in elementary. And so I grew up and I had to do a lot of unpacking about that. And so I think just remaining contacted to your own humanity and thinking, what I want people thinking about me and my loved ones this way, how can I prevent that and encourage people to, again, think critically about that.
You know what's really interesting about that? I realized recently a lot of possession movies, the undertone is if you're not this religion, you're gonna get possessed. So that just made me think about that.
So Aiden, you brought up that there was different versions and variations, which is something that we see a lot. So how do you address that evolution of just folklore and ghost stories that are just constantly changing with different generations and different oral storytelling? So do you include all variations, or do you just stick to like the oldest one that's been told the most, or how do you go about that?
So the way that I explain the stories that I tell, because there are so many different versions, is I say that they're kind of like Dr. Frankenstein, and I'm pulling from each different culture to put one story together. Again, my show is very narrative driven, so I will do storytelling. And then after, when I am having that conversation, I may explain each source. And I'm like, okay, this aspect of the story came from this source and from this culture, and this is how they tell that story. And then this next part of the story came from this culture or this aspect. And so just making sure to be as transparent as possible, even down to sharing the sources that I'm using with my audience and saying, this is the website you can go to. And if you look for this article, you're gonna find what I used to put the story together, so that they can do their own research if they want.
Gotcha. So Christina, Carmen, do you guys do a lot of that as well, where you're like, hey guys, if you want to look this up for yourselves, like here's every single thing that we found, and like just kind of grouping it all together?
So I have ADHD and I forget sources to put them in the show notes all the time. I'm like, it's gonna be in the show notes, and then it's not. But literally, if anyone messages me, I can find them and I will. But most of the time, what we do is like, this is how we heard it, this is how someone else heard it, or in this country, this is the version they share. In this other country, this is how it goes. And I think because we're more conversational, we can like, oh, here's how it goes here, here's how it goes over there. And we just go like in order, like. So we share almost any version we can find, we'll share it.
That's awesome. Actually, another example that just came to me, I did this, the Susto Hotel is another great example, because that story gets so much wrapped up in the paranormal, but also mental health and true crime. And when I did those stories a long time ago, I did what actually happened, the theory of her, like, you know, people say, was she killed or was there mental health? So I tried, like you were saying, trying to add different angles to it. And so I did multiple parts for that story because I knew that people get so upset about it because of the mental health aspect. which is very fair. So I think like you can do multiple parts to it, and it's like you were saying earlier, continue on that conversation with your audience too.
Yeah. So now that we have like talked about a bunch of ways that we remain ethical and a bunch of ways that we really try to broaden our horizons when it comes to finding the correct information and all of those facts, do you have any advice for someone who's aspiring to be a new podcaster and who wants to create paranormal or folklore content that's like ethical and respectful? What's like something that you would tell them, that's something that maybe you did not know before you started?
I would say to be very open to growth and to feedback. I mean, not all of it is going to be constructive, and that's fine. But yeah, just being very open to growth and to feedback, and to leaning on creators who are doing similar things. And I know that we talk in Slack Week, and we've talked a lot about a lot of work that we do, and I know that like we cover a lot of the same topics too, a lot of the same stories, but I've always operated from a place of like there's room for all of us, and ultimately we are going to bring our own perspectives. And so I would encourage people to also not feel like, well, somebody's already doing that, or oh, they're doing the same thing I'm doing. Well, maybe similar but not the same. Like, we're going to be our own perspectives. We have our own background. So being open to that growth, and also to remembering that there's room for all of us. There's room for all of our voices.
I think the biggest thing I say to people is look up the word ethnocentrism. It's approaching one culture or story or whatever it might be. It's typically assigned to approaching culture with the bias of your own, because whether we realize it or not, all of us do that. And when you have the understanding that this is a psychological, sociological tendency that is kind of learned through society, you can start to step away from that habit. Another thing is research is tedious, but you have to research every single perspective, whether it insults your view of the world, whether it upsets you, you have to research every single perspective. And we see that a lot with this current culture, is that we research what we want to know. We have confirmation bias. We don't research what makes us uncomfortable. And I've had situations where I've heard of, people reaching out to creators and saying, hey, this was my culture, and, you only researched one side, one half of it. Can you research the other half? And the creator is like, no, what? I don't agree with that. I'm not going to research it. So telling these stories, telling these cases, whatever it might be, it should take you more than an hour of research. That's my biggest thing. That's why Pamela is on my podcast, because she's a certified researcher. It's harder than you guys might think.
Sorry, I'm not again. I think for me is one of the things that I've learned, and I'm so thankful for, is community, right? Like, I think a lot of creators get into the space and they think that they have to tackle everything on their own, but it's like, don't be afraid to create that community, because at the end of the day, like, we're gonna go through these ebb and flows of feeling like, are we saying something appropriate for the mass? Are we validated in our feelings? And I'm so thankful that I have like group chats with like a lot of creators, and they have helped me understand how to approach very sensitive situations, or being proud of my work, and really just being proud of what you do, even if it's in baby steps. So I think that's really important. Like you were saying earlier, like, there's room for everybody at the table, but part of that is being proactively active in your community offline as well.
Yeah, and sorry, I thought you were saying. Okay, I would say also, and I think it's something we've been repeating throughout this whole panel, but if you're talking about a culture, like, really look into it, because there's a podcast that I love them. I listen to it. I've been listening to it since it started, like 2018, I don't know when it started. But they covered a legend that I think maybe the four of us are more familiar with here, but the legend of La Lechuza. And they were reading the story, and this is something we've talked about so much, and there's so much that we know about it that they just didn't even mention. And like, I've never been on that end of actually no, I have. But like, you hear these big creators talking about places that stories that are close to you, and they are getting like a lot of things wrong, or they're like, obviously they have big teams and they have researchers and they're like, oh, they didn't write this down, so we don't know. I'm like, are you not reading this beforehand? What do you mean you don't know? So they'll be like, well, why did they do this? Like, the lechuza is this, there's a lot of versions of it. Sometimes it's a witch that shapeshifts into an owl. And they're like, why would they be scared of an owl? And I'm like, you don't even know. What do you mean? But there's another version of the legend where it's one owl and it's one witch and she's been around forever and she, I don't know, eats babies and takes them. And it's like, you don't go outside and you don't whistle after a certain time because she's gonna come get you. But they were like, well, where does this even come from? Or we don't know, so we're just gonna skip over this. And we heard it, and we actually had Lainey on an episode because she has a lechuza story. And it's just like, I know it sounds silly when you hear it and you don't know about it, but that's why it's important to find people in that culture because it's not silly. So yeah, I think it's always approaching from a respectful manner because there's like another example of something that if I could go back and redo, there's a legend from Colombia and it's called La Tunda. And it's honestly, it's a little silly because there's a version where they say that
she farts on shrimp and then feeds it to people to hypnotize them.
And yeah, that is a little silly, and maybe I might have laughed a little too much when I first heard it. I think I could not stop laughing, honestly, because it was a little silly. But then we were laughing, but we always go back and say, but did you know that La Tunda was a group of formerly enslaved women who escaped into the jungles, and the reason that this legend was created was to scare other people who were trying to escape enslavement so that they wouldn't go into the jungle and be hypnotized by these witches. So we always try to find the reason, but I think a lot of people skip over that. I heard another podcast, I'm going on and on, but another podcast talks about the legend of El Cadejo. This is so big in El Salvador. It's a dog, and when you hear it, you're like, why would anyone be scared of a dog? But like, when El Salvador was being colonized, and not just El Salvador, the Spaniards had dogs that were so big that no one had ever seen before, and they were killing babies with these dogs. Of course they're going to be scared of a dog, and these legends, you may not know the origin, but there's an origin and there's a reason they persist. So like, that's something that I wish I could just like message these people. Sometimes I do message, but they go unread, but I'm like, you don't even know. So yeah, just always look into the history because there's a reason it exists.
Positive intent, guys. So assume a positive intent in every story. Seek to understand without any assumptions of negativity. Because you'll probably end up looking dumb, like you just said. Like these people look dumb assuming negativity.
Yes. Well, that's another thing. You said sometimes you message and they leave you on read. One thing that I always tell people is you need to be willing to delete content. Because the people you are affecting, the people you're talking about, are more important than your stupid accounts. Not calling them stupid, but if you're unwilling to delete content, like I very, very early in my career, I had covered skinwalkers and wendigos, and I had an indigenous creator make a video and say, this is not your story to tell, and so I removed it. Because he's right, it's not my story to tell, and if someone from the community I'm talking about says no, then it's not my right to argue with that.
Yes, and I've done the same, pulled videos out, because in the beginning, I didn't know any of this. I think 2020, I started making TikToks to try and promote the podcast, and someone asked for a story from our hometown, I just went to go pee, but her hippo. Right, no, hippo doesn't apply here, okay? I don't, no, I'm just kidding.
Just bring respect to the panel. We just like to talk about personal things sometimes.
So someone asked for a story from our hometown, which is Modesto, California, and I knew of some little of these places. I was like, I'm gonna find like a good story, and it was so problematic. I'm like, a family was murdered in this house, and I was like, I covered the story and why people think it's haunted, and then probably a year or two later, nobody said anything. I thought it was fine. And a year or two later, someone was like, this is so problematic, like this family suffered, this isn't even haunted, blah, blah, blah. And at first I was like, I don't know, but I found it online. It was like on the news, like it's fine. But then I'm like, no, you know what? It's true. I don't want to like sensationalize this true crime story. I don't want to, and I don't think like looking back, I didn't say like anything obviously positive about like the guy or anything, but yeah, I think it was the way I probably shared it was not good, so I pulled it. Another example was we had a guy come on our podcast, and I didn't know, I always vet your guests. So he was so annoying and problematic. He kept making, we were talking about Colombia, and he kept making jokes about narcos and like all these drugs, and I keep forgetting to, but I'm pulling that episode, and it did numbers. I don't care. Someone said, I can't believe that he said all these insensitive things, and I remember always staring it back. I was like, no, that's not what happened. No, that's not. But like, I don't know. This guy just like trampled all over it, and it wasn't like a first time experience. I never had anyone like try and like steal my show like that. I was like, oh, I don't know what to say. So I'm pulling that because I'm like, no, that's problematic. So like you said, it's always okay to just private something, hide it, delete it, then address it.
Or issue a correction. There was an instance where you just reminded me of this. I talked about Puritan culture because I was reading through an antique book that I had, and I was talking about what I know about Puritan culture, and someone reached out to me and they're like, hey, they're so Puritans, like, that's not all true. And so we were still so new, I couldn't take it down, so I said, do you want me to issue a correction? I asked her, what do you want me to do? And I, like, at that point, like, I was scared to take it down. I was scared to, like, oh my God, I'm gonna lose this episode. But in asking what she wanted me to do, she just wanted me to issue a correction. And I did. I took time in the next episode and I was like, hey, this is not accurate. I offended some people and I'm really sorry. So another thing in that is always apologize, because even if you don't agree, and like with this, I didn't fully agree because I have done copious amounts of research, but that doesn't matter because I affected people. I affected a group of people. So I always say personally, professionally, even if you don't agree, always apologize for how you affected someone, and especially as a creator, podcaster, whatever you might be in the public eye, because you are most likely offending so many more people than just one interpersonal relationship.
So just to wrap everything up, it sounds like not only do you guys really incorporate a lot of educational factors on your podcast, and you really make it an effort to ensure that there is an educational benefit to listening to your content, and that's fantastic. So as we wrap up today, I want to give a massive thank you to our panelists. You guys created a beautiful discussion, and as this comes to a close, we want to reflect the importance of just approaching these subjects with integrity and sensitivity, and we explored the complexities of navigating cultural boundaries, maintaining ethical standards, and just respecting the histories and beliefs tied to supernatural narratives. So we're going to make sure that we carry all of this and share all of it and carry it forward into our careers, and I want to make sure everyone has a wonderful rest of your day.